So I'm here with the Green Party candidate for Sheffield Central, Jillian Creasy. Jillian, just to start off with, before we start looking at the Green policies ahead of the election, just wondered if I could get your reaction to the news that broke over the weekend regarding the parliamentary affairs, including Jack Straw and Malcolm Bifkin. I mean, the idea of buying influence in Parliament. I mean, what's your sort of reaction to that?
To be honest, I don't know about that particular story, but I mean, it's not a news story, is it really? I mean, the whole thing about buying influence has been going on for ages, and it clearly brings the whole of government into disrepute, doesn't it? I mean, just to sort of extend on that, I was preparing for a talk that I'm giving to the BMA on health and just looking at the way that privatisation of the health service works, and just looking at the involvement of various MPs from all parties in some of the private health providers. And, you know, this is a very direct interest in it, really. And I think that's really, really bad for democracy.
So obviously, as an external almost party, and also as a candidate, you're obviously looking on that. One of the main policies that you have which would affect students is the idea that the Green Party would abolish tuition fees. There's been statistics which were made recently that the numbers of people from disadvantaged backgrounds applying to university have risen despite the number of tuition fees, and that 3 times the amount of money is spent on poorer students in England than in Scotland, where of course they don't have tuition fees. Yeah. So if your party was to abolish tuition fees, how would you support poorer students without this fee support?
Well, I mean, they wouldn't need fee support because they'd be having free, they wouldn't be paying fees. So, you know, everybody would be on the same basis, whether they were from a wealthy family or a poor family, they would be on the same basis.
Without the fees coming in, there's going to be less money to be... The money that's come in seems to have been spent on...
Well, no, I see what you mean. Okay, so you're saying that there'd be less money available. Yeah. No, I mean, obviously we would have to find ways of funding universities. Like, you know, before there were tuition fees chargeable to students, the universities were directly funded by the government, just like schools are or colleges used to be. So we would return to a system where university education was publicly funded. And that would be paid for through taxes, probably on the wealthiest corporations, because they're the ones that most directly benefit from it. But I mean, coming back to your point that there have been recent figures, I agree with you that the information has come out that poorer students seem to be well represented, and you know, obviously that's good if people aren't being put off. But I do think that there is a real issue about what's going to happen to those people as they come out of university and they, I don't know, try to buy a house or, you know, get married, have kids, begin to move into a slightly better paid job, and they suddenly find that 9% of their income is being paying off the fees. So, you know, they may be making that decision now, and, you know, good on them if they're prepared to take that risk. But I think they're going to come a cropper later, and that's what we want to prevent. I mean, the other thing is that the fee system is actually costing the government more, isn't it? Because people aren't paying it back, like so many people on very low wages. So in the end, it is actually costing more. So, you know, the system isn't working. Does that answer your question?
Yes, but there's obviously the elephant in the fact that the Green Party, as you are in your size at the moment, are likely to only come to power via coalition.
Yeah.
Well,
we wouldn't form a coalition, but I know what you mean.
But say something like that would happen, isn't perhaps promising fee abolition giving some form of false hope, and given the positions of the other parties and their refusal and their...
Yeah, well, we can't promise it. All we can say is that it's in our manifesto. So those are the things, you know, and I guess there's different sort of levels of commitment, aren't there? But, you know, the Green Party has policies for a sustainable society which set out, you know, what our vision is, what we do in an ideal world if we ruled the world. Yeah, and then we have a manifesto which sets out what we would like to do if we had the power to do it. So if we were running government, this is what we would do. But we obviously also say, you know, we're well aware that we are most unlikely to form the next government. We're going to be working by trying to influence whatever government is formed, and we would obviously be kind of picking on some of those issues and pushing as hard as we could on some of those. And certainly student fees is one of those issues that we'd be pushing. But I mean, I don't think anybody said that they can promise. How could they?
Yes, I suppose so. But obviously, it is still rather unlikely that this figurehead policy that the Green Party have come up with, of abolishing tuition fees, it is still rather than it would require the Green Party bringing around whatever major party is in whatever party has come to power, and that is a rather unlikely vision.
Well, I mean, I think you could say that about all the Green Party policies, couldn't you? I mean, we've also said that we want to reverse austerity, we want to introduce a wealth tax, we want to stop tax evasion and tax avoidance. We want to introduce VAT on certain kinds of foods and have pollution taxes and so on and so on. I mean, we're not going to be able to do all of those things. All we can do is set out our stall and then hope that we can push on some of those. I would think, and in a way, that's what any party does, isn't it? Is to say that this is what we'd like to do. I mean, I think the particular thing with student fees, and I'm guessing that why you might be coming at it, is that when the Lib Dems were trying to get some influence in 2010, they actually made pledges, didn't they? And the pledge that they made, they kind of said, this is our policy. We don't want a rise in tuition fees. They didn't commit to abolishing them, but they said they didn't want rises in tuition fees. And individual MPs pledged to vote against a rise in tuition fees. So there were kind of two levels to it. They actually failed on both those levels. But I still think it was, for everything that happened, I don't agree with them making a pledge and not sticking to it, but I think it was valid for them to say, this is what our policy is, we will do our best to get that policy, or as much as possible, through the next Parliament.
So, if we move on from tuition fees debates, how else would you look to push students' interests in Parliament, given that if you were to win this election, you would be representing, if you were to win this Sheffield Central constituency, you would be representing more students than any other constituency in the country?
Yeah, it's kind of huge part of the constituency, isn't it? I think it's about 38% of the potential voters, at any rate. I think the manifesto that's set out by the combined student groups, which I'm sure you're aware of, is really good. I think it's great that you've produced something that is, pretty far-reaching and actually not just about students. So I think the issue about housing is really important, and the Green Party is very interested in setting rents, so that you'd have a rent cap and that rents would only increase in line with inflation, and that we'd have a register of landlords. There was more control over what landlords are doing, and that's all part of trying to bring housing back under some kind of control, so that housing is about somewhere for people to live rather than somewhere for other people to make a lot of money out of. I think the other things on education that are important is just kind of other policies on education, is to bring back EMA, the Educational Maintenance Allowance, because I think the group that we tend to forget, that people haven't gone to university, but they've maybe gone on to a sixth form college and kind of looking for some support. And then a whole kind of sweeping change, really, is what we'd like to see of secondary education, getting rid of academy schools and free schools, bringing schools back under local authority control. So
on the school debate, obviously you say in Sheffield you'd look to abolish academy and academy schools in Sheffield, and what would that affect those going to those schools? How would their education be affected?
Well, you'd have to phase them out gradually, wouldn't you? But the kind of principle is that what you're doing is saying that schools should be run kind of under the aegis of the local authority. What happens at the moment is that the local authority gets a certain amount of money, which actually hasn't been cut over the last government, but it's given out then to individual schools who can do what they want with it, if they're academy schools or free schools, and they're not answerable to the local authority, they're answerable to the Secretary of State. So they can go off in pretty much whatever direction they like. And yet the local authority is still charged with responsibility for having a school place for every pupil in its area. And that just seems, completely sort of unfair mismatch. I think you need to bring that control back to the local authorities.
Another, obviously the Green Party is most commonly associated with the idea of renewable energy and moving away from these fossil fuels. The University of Sheffield has recently refused to divest its income from fossil fuels. What would you do, both on a local and I suppose your party on a national level, to encourage divestment from fossil fuels?
Well, I think in terms of, if you're talking about national government, it's a kind of slightly different issue, isn't it? Because if you're talking about a university or a pension fund, then they're making choices about kind of where they invest their money, and I think that, ultimately it is their choice. So, we're very much in favour of the campaign that the students here have been running, and it seems to have made some kind of impact, even if it hasn't completely succeeded. And we're supporting a similar campaign in the South Yorkshire Pensions Authority. But I think there is quite a subtle thing here that, ideally you would see sort of complete divestment. But on the other hand, you don't want it to happen sort of immediately and all at once, because actually what you want those companies to be doing is shifting their focus from fossil fuels to renewables. And one of the best things that people like universities and pension funds can do is to try to work cooperatively with the people that they invest with to try and encourage and persuade them to shift them. But I mean, if you're talking about what a green government would do, if we imagine such a thing, and you're obviously pretty dubious about it, but if you imagine our kind of vision for a green government, then we're talking about the government making direct investments in renewable energy.
And what about on a local level? In Sheffield Central, how would you encourage companies at local level to divest from fossil fuels?
Well, I don't think companies at a local level are investing in fossil fuels. I think you mean sort of encourage local companies to get involved in renewables. Yeah, okay. Well, I mean, that could happen through government schemes, and actually what's happened under the current government is that we lost the FITs, which was an incentive scheme whereby if you put up a solar panel, then you get a feed-in tariff, and that feed-in tariff was just cut very, very rapidly, and then that had a really, really bad effect on the companies that were putting up solar panels, and they certainly never moved towards a renewable heat incentive, which was going to be, the next technology coming online. So I think through government we could reinstate those kind of schemes, and then that would have a knock-on effect on local companies. I think it would also be really beneficial for the local authorities, because the most successful scheme in Sheffield was the Warm Front scheme, which was about the council running a scheme that encouraged people to take up. It wasn't actually about renewables in that case, it was about energy saving. But through the council they were able to use government money, so it was money that was coming from the energy companies, but through government, to pay for people to have free insulation, loft insulation, cavity wall insulation. And that was a really, really effective programme, because what the local authority could do was identify those areas that were most in need of it, where the houses that were suitable for treatment were, and where the areas that had most fuel poverty, so they could really home in and do it on a kind of geographical level. Because if you work on the street and people say, oh, my neighbour's had that done, well, she's had it done as well, oh, I might get my house done as well. It's more effective than just sort of individual people taking it up.
Another topic close to the heart for a lot of constituents and students in Sheffield Central is the idea of international students and whether or not they should be allowed to stay to work in the UK after their degree.
Yeah.
What are your thoughts on this?
Well, it's Green Party policy that they should be allowed to stay for 2 years. And, you know, one of the things that happens at the moment is that they have to go back home and then reapply, which is very unfair. You know, if you're a very wealthy foreign student, you might be able to do that, but if you're on a low income, you're not going to be able to, so it's very, very divisive. So we think they ought to be able to stay for 2 years and work here, and in effect, you know, put back into this country some of the education that they've gained and benefit themselves before they go back home. You know, I think it brings us on to the whole question of migration, really. And, you know, the Greens are certainly very, very clear that there should be free migration within the EU, and that we should have foreign policies that really ultimately stop people wanting to escape the countries where they're suffering sort of economic deprivations in order to come here.
Final question in the interview, and it's more sort of a semantic point, but do you worry perhaps that the Green Party and its emergence among students will perhaps risk splitting the left vote? And so when it comes to the election, there'll be a split between Labour, and this would allow a Conservative or a UKIP candidate to come through in the election. Is that a worry that you have?
Well, I think if you get into talking about tactical voting, which is what you're doing really, if you're saying it's about splitting votes and letting the Tories in, you know, that's certainly a line that's being used at national level. But if you're talking about tactical voting, then it's really important to know which constituency you are voting in. And in Sheffield Central constituency, you know, it's a straight choice between Labour and the Greens. The Tories, UKIP, Lib Dems, you know, they're not going to come anywhere. So if people want to vote Green, then they can vote Green, and, you know, the worst thing that's going to happen is they're going to get Labour. It, you know, absolutely is a choice between the two.